Hello, my name is Tanya Bolden, and I'm the Director of Supply Chain and Corporate Responsibility Programs at AIAG. Joining me today is Lecedra Welch, AIAG's Environmental Sustainability Program Manager. And we want to bring to you a message today about sustainability challenges and how the automotive industry is rising to the occasion. First, I want to thank AEM for the invitation to present to you today. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, we were unable to be there in person. However, we hope that the presentation we've put together for you provides benefit. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk to you about today are our just AIAG. We're going to give you a little bit of an overview so that you have context on the basis as to why we're doing what we do for those that are unfamiliar with AIAG. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the drivers that we're seeing that are driving some of the actions that our companies as well as AIAG, the industry, is taking to address them. We're also going to share some insight on the industry response and how we're collaborating with others to address these challenges. And we're also going to provide some resources as to where companies can begin and other information that would be available to them. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, AIAG, you'll see here by the brands represented, AIAG's board member includes, our board member structure includes OEMs and suppliers, both within the automotive supply chain as well as the heavy equipment supply chain. We're also looking to grow our membership to include semiconductor companies as well as aerospace, and we've been making some good progress there. So on the next slide, you'll see how we do what we do. So when you look at the makeup of AIAG, we have 34 OEM worldwide companies. We have 3,800 direct suppliers as well as 450 indirect suppliers. We derive our subject matter expertise from volunteers from these companies who come together and identify and prioritize the industry challenges and identify potential solutions in which we can do to help the automotive supply chain. Now, at present, AIAG is one of the largest and the most diverse automotive association, again, with our membership of OEMs as well as suppliers. So now, on the next slide, let's talk a little bit about how we have organized our corporate responsibility program area. That's primarily the staff that's looking to address ESG, which we're commonly referring to it as today, which covers environmental, social, and governance. So you'll see we have our steering committee here, which is looking at issues at the 100,000 foot level. What are those issues that are going to be impacting the supply chain, and which ones do we need to monitor as opposed to those in which we need to actively engage around? We have a subset of OEMs that are working collaboratively with their European colleagues to ensure that the output that they provide is global in scope, but also common and consistent, such that we are delivering a consistent message to the supply chain. Now, when it comes to our volunteer work groups, we have them largely grouped together in the environmental as well as the social space. For social activities, you'll see that we're doing responsible materials and focusing there. We're also focusing our efforts on human rights and forced labor. And in the environmental space, we're looking at environmental sustainability, and there are various groups that are formed there. And we are also addressing global chemical regulatory issues, both of which Lecedra will speak about more in a moment. So now let's move on to the next slide and talk about some of those drivers that I referenced. The drivers we're seeing are largely in the form of governmental legislation, customer mandates, and other various requirements that are being placed on the supply chain globally. They have global impact, where we're seeing a lot of these coming out of the US as well as Europe. So let's talk about a few of those. First, I want to talk about CTPAT, as we call it, but it stands for the U.S. Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. This initiative was created following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. At that time, the U.S. government formulated the Homeland Security Department, and CTPAT was one of the initiatives that came out of that as well. CTPAT is a multi-layered cargo enforcement strategy that is led and enforced by the U.S. Customs Border Protection. Now, you'll see from the photos here, we're talking about rail, air, and marine, ways in which goods are transported cross borders. Now, there has always been a criteria established for CTPAT, but in 2018, CBP added 5 new elements of criteria, and you'll see those listed there, but note the one on forced labor. The U.S. government, in addition to having the established criteria, they have enacted the U.S. Uyghur Labor Law Act that was signed into law in December of 2021. Again, that is to ensure that any goods that are transported into the United States or consumed or produced by its companies do not encourage or add to the human rights atrocities such as forced labor, child labor, and just general human rights abuses. So CBP is also charged with enforcement of the U.S. Uyghur labor law. A little bit of a mouthful there. So again, we're seeing increased focus there. Now let's contrast that on the next slide by looking at what we're seeing in Europe. Now, I realize this slide is a bit of an eye chart, but I share this with you to just draw your attention to the scope and scale. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the U.S. is one federal legislative body, whereas in the EU, there are 27 countries. And we are starting to see in the EU them proposing template legislation such that it can be enacted by various countries that are looking to focus on these issues. So you have the potential for far more legislation coming out. And it is, hoped that some of those countries will maintain the same type of legislation, but there is the potential for variation within that legislation. Now, we're also seeing a new component being added to legislation that is being placed on the supply chain, and that is the existence or the verification of company management systems. We're anticipating that's going to be a key component of pending as well as future legislation to come. Now, on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the environmental laws that are coming out of Europe, and I'll turn it over to Lecedra to address that.
Thank you. One important environmental and chemical regulation is the EU Green Deal. EU strives to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. So in order to do that, they have set some goals for themselves, such as having zero carbon steel, having net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and all in order to have a better quality of life, better jobs, and a toxic-free environment. Now, in order to do that, they have set up some steps to help them achieve that. So the first is to set up a circular economy action plan. Then they're going to do a chemical strategy for sustainability, looking at how to make chemicals safe and sustainable. And then they're going to look at the essential uses of chemicals and possibly restrict some of those chemicals, for example, PFAS. So by restricting PFAS, it's going to add hundreds or thousands of new substances to the already growing list that are out there, such as Gadzol, and it will also increase due diligence efforts. We also have the Battery Directive. This directive regulates manufacturing and disposal of batteries to protect human health and the environment. It requires producers to properly label their products for recycled content, any kind of hazardous substances that can cause risk. The goal is to create a battery passport system, which allows the battery to have specific information relayed in it, just like its weight and its chemical composition. So look for more information to be coming as this regulation is continually expanding to learn more about the battery directive, including the digital battery passport. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Tanya to talk about ratings and rankings and non-financial information.
Thank you, Lecedra. So today, when you're discussing ESG or sustainability, however you wish to refer to it, you would be remiss if you did not talk about the attention that's being placed on these initiatives by the financial sector. Now, what many companies need to realize is that the non-financial information that you place out there and for public consumption, that could include your environmental reports, your sustainability reports, all of this information is being consumed and digested by the financial community. Now, you'll see here just a diagram that depicts some of the players in the field. Some of them you may be familiar with. This field includes many different actors, and they play a different role, including those that are nonprofit standards setters and those that are for-profit data aggregators, as well as ratings providers. So there's some companies whose specific intent is to gather and synthesize the information, such as a Bloomberg. Then you'll have those that may use this data to come up with questionnaires or surveys and things of that nature that you may be asked to comply with, CDP being one of those. But then you have other companies that are looking to establish standards based on that, or surveys. And that's where you may see some of the other companies, such as Sustainalytics. But the key takeaway that I want to leave with you on this is that various actors in the financial and non-financial sector are evaluating your companies on various ESG elements. Now, this is largely influenced by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. It's important to note that a major consumer of these reports are the investors and the asset managers that factor into your ability to secure capital. So just something to be mindful of. So those are just a few high-level drivers that we're seeing within the automotive industry. But now let's turn our attention to how industry is responding and collaborating through various guidance, assessments, and standards. So next, let's talk about the Automotive Industry Global Guiding Principles. These principles were initially published by AIAG back in 2008, and over time they have grown in scope and they have grown in endorsement. Now, initially, the automotive industry felt that we needed to take a responsible role and make sure that we were communicating the expectations for ethics and integrity to the supply chain. And that's what these guiding principles were initially formulated to do. At first, we started focusing on human rights and working conditions, but over time, it's grown to include in the environmental standards as well as business ethics. It has also grown in scope beyond the initial 3 OEMs that began working on this project, but now you'll see here the OEMs that globally, those in Europe and the US, that endorse these principles. Now, the principles have grown in addition to just being focused on the 3 areas. We felt that we needed to be a little more granular or provide more context for the suppliers so they clearly understood what the company's expectations were. And as a result of that, we developed the practical guidance document. Now, it's important for me to note that both of these documents are currently under development, and they will be launched in Q2 of 2022. It will take into account the legislation that is out there and what is companies are being asked to report against, and other factors that we're seeing and other elements to really help the supply chain be more environmentally, socially, and well positioned for governance issues. Now, to let you know how we are using this information to affect supplier assessment, we have the supplier assessment questionnaires. Many of you may be familiar with those. Drive Sustainability out of Europe is taking a major leading role in creating a supplier assessment questionnaires, again, based on the global guiding principles. Some of the companies that are enacting or providing facilitation to suppliers to gather this data is InQC and EcoVadis. So here's an example how companies have come together, collaborated on the important issues, communicated their expectations, and operationalized them in the form of an assessment. So on the next slide, I want to talk briefly about the quality standard, the automotive quality standard. So for some of you that may be in the automotive supply chain, you may be subject to IATF 16949. Again, that's our automotive quality standard. And this is based on ISO 9000. The primary focus of this standard is quality. But for the first time, there was a non-quality element added to this standard a few years back, and that has to deal with ethics. So this standard includes 3 high-level ethics questions to address the existence of a supplier's code of conduct, an anti-bribery policy, and a whistleblower policy. So here's an example where we took an existing standard pervasively used within the automotive supply chain, but have incorporated this ESG factor, that being ethics, into it. It's important to note that more than 72,000 sites worldwide are being audited to this standard. So we're beginning to get information or data on the existence of these 3 ethics elements. So on the next slide, let's talk a little bit about responsible mineral sourcing. Responsible sourcing of materials and minerals is a big issue. Now, this too is one issue that was placed on the industry by legislation back in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act, to make sure that we could understand the use of 3TG, or tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold within the supply chain, to make sure that companies, industries were not contributing to the human rights atrocities that were happening in Central Europe. Industry, I think, has done well in rising to this occasion and operationalizing around that. We at AIAG still maintain a work group that's looking not only at 3TG, but we're looking more broadly at mica, cobalt, lithium, and other materials that will be used in our BEV vehicles. So you'll see here just an overview on the work group, but you'll see 4 key areas in which we're engaging. We are working with smelters, going through the supply chain and working with smelters to make sure they're being audited. We're working with entities to make sure we fully understand what the global requirements are and what it takes to meet those successfully. We're also trying to identify what are those materials or those minerals that will be prioritized and that we're likely to see the need for reporting going forward. We're, of course, trying to share industry best practices with others, as well as learn from them, and then sharing the information that we have with our member companies, our supply chains, and with organizations such as AEM. When it comes to stakeholder engagement on this issue, we are heavily engaged with RMI, or the Responsible Minerals Initiative, as well as OECD. So here are just a few examples of what we've been doing in the social space, and I'll turn it over to Lecedra to cover what's happening in the chemical regulatory space.
Thank you, Tanya. So our chemical management group, we make sure the industry is abreast of all the regulations that's going on, anything that's going on within IMDS, and we provide that input to the IMDS steering committee. There's thousands and thousands of regulations out there, so our work group makes sure that we pass down to the supply chain the most relevant regulations that impact day-to-day business. A small background, IMDS was created to address the ELV directive. So we make sure that we continue to update the industry on what's going on, any chemical lists, any additional chemicals that are added to the list. And we work with other organizations, which I'll talk about that on the next slide. But as we mentioned in the previous slides about other work groups that we have here at AIAG to make sure that we are in line with all the regulations and IMDS changes, we have our GHS work group, which feed into GADSO, which feeds into ROHAS, and which feeds into REACH. The REACH task force assigns assignments, down to the organizations, and through the GHS, we address those. Our recommendation and documentation work group is a very important group because that work group develops enhancements for the new versions of IMDS, as well as model office testing of those enhancements. We have our IMDS conference every year, which is coming up in October 11th and 12th, where we have a group that plans that event. It focuses on global legislation and any IMDS changes. And we also have a global regulatory updates page on our website. We have a link at the bottom here for you to go to our website to learn more about what we're doing in chemical management. But that landing page specifically gives updates to global regulations that impact day-to-day businesses. So it provides awareness around specific automotive legislation. And then our final subgroup we have is another one of our most important work groups. It's our Supplier Alliance, which is made up of members of suppliers from AIAG, CLEPA, and JPIA. We feel that this is the key to the OEM and supplier connection. So over the past years, our communication between the OEMs and suppliers have improved based on Supplier Alliance. We provide that voice to the OEMs and our voice to the IMDS steering committee. We meet twice a year, and one of the projects that we're working on right now for the IMDS steering committee is to come up with a best practice to help electronic companies report into IMDS due to the deactivation of Reg 19, a material classification 8.x. So below here are some other organizations that AIAG we interact with on a regular basis, and we are very proud of our alliances with these organizations, and we hope to continue to further and grow our relationship with these organizations and others to make sure that the suppliers get their voices out there and make their voices heard. So with that, I will turn it back over to Tanya to talk about where to begin.
Thank you, Lecedra. So where to begin? We've talked about, we've just scratched the surface on some of the legislation that is out there, some of the mandates, some of the requirements, and some of the work that's being done within the automotive sector on these. So where to begin? We encourage companies to make sure that they have an internal network of business leaders that are regularly discussing current and emerging issues to ensure that there are no surprises and that they are best positioned to meet them for their company. Secondly, we encourage companies to assess the material issues for their companies, whether you do a materiality report or you just look at your supply chain against what the laws are in the areas in which you have operations. As I mentioned, some of the things that we're seeing coming out of Europe, specifically with the German Due Diligence Act, is that law does not solely apply to companies that are headquartered in Germany, but if your company has operations in Germany and meets a certain threshold, being the number of employees working there, that law applies to you, or it may not apply to you. But it's important to understand where your exposure is on many of these issues. On the next slide, point number 3 that we encourage companies to do is take a look at your company's policies and procedures and enhance them where needed. An outdated policy is of no value to you, so make sure that it's current. It's not always best to start with a new sheet of paper, but looking at what you currently have and amending and updating that accordingly. We do encourage companies to engage with business consortia and industry groups, such as Lecedra and I both pointed out some of the collaboration that's going on. One, it helps your global standpoint, you learn from others, and you can share with others as well. And fifth and final, we do encourage companies to collaborate with their industry. Work with companies within your sector to identify solutions, because that we hope will minimize the cost and complexity that your company may be dealing with in terms of coming up with common tools and common solutions, which is the space in which AIAG works upon. I neglected to mention earlier, as Lecedra did, we do have an IMDS event coming up in October, but we also have an ESG event coming up in June, where in both of these events, we're going to be speaking to many of these issues and bringing in speakers that can talk more in depth and allow individuals an opportunity to have a dialogue or start a conversation with them. So hopefully you'll be able to take a look at those opportunities as well. But on our last slide here, you will see our contact information. As you continue your discussions in your event today or amongst your colleagues, if you have any questions for myself or Lecedra, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We welcome your discussions and an opportunity to speak with you. So with that, on behalf of Lecedra and AIAG, again, we thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and we wish you a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.